All right, Cynthia. Cynthia, are you there? Cynthia Becker.
I am here. I don't know. Oh,
do you have
my
video?
video.
There
Here we
you
go.
go. And Connie Reguli, are you there?
Reguli.
Regularly.
I am here. I am.
How are you?
Okay. How are you? I've been listening to you guys. I don't know if you saw my comments, but
Yeah, I did.
you
I
know,
did.
I've heard
You're
those
like,
words
I say
too.
the magician one all the time. I read your comments.
Well, but I've also heard those words, misregulate. Let me make it easy for you. When or you'll go to jail. So, and obviously they did everything they could to try to put me there. But yeah, thank you, Vince, for working so hard to put this together. And I'm so happy to be here.
I'm glad to hear that. Now, Cynthia is going to be talking to you and you guys are going to be talking together. But I just want to tell everyone that's watching this show, this lady is truly royalty in the fight against CPS nationwide. So hopefully you'll talk to Cynthia and tell people what you've been doing. I'm going to bow out for a quick break, but I'll see you guys in about an hour.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Vince.
Hi, Connie.
Hello. How are you today?
I'm good. I will just quickly start and then I'm gonna leave everything to you. So I'm Cynthia. I am a mom of 2 children who has a horrific CPS story. And I did end up getting my kids back, but it did take about 2 years. So that was very difficult. And now to be part of this community, I also host a show. It's called the reality series, CPS The Horror Stories, where I interview other parents and family members, and even the victims of children who've grown up in the system, and hear about their stories. Because I do feel, the more of us that come out with our stories, the more informed other parents can be. So, and then Connie, your turn.
Yeah. So thank you all for that great introduction. I kind of don't like the word royalty attached to CPS. It's a bit frightening. It makes me sound like maybe I'm the CPS, and obviously I am the Achilles heel, the nemesis, the feared and hated Connie Reguli, and in Tennessee. And I've worked with families for about 3 decades. And really, at first I thought the world was going to be fair, and it's not fair. And I learned about due process. I went back to law school late in life. I had a whole nother life, a whole nother world before that. And I got into law and I started working CPS cases, and it was just astounding. There were so many things that were so wrong with it. So I'm really happy to be here today. I've done, people can find me, I'll just say real quickly, on Facebook and on Connie Reguli or the Family Forward Project, as well as on YouTube. Now, I was reached out to and asked to talk about the politics of CPS. And and I said, yes, of course, I'd love to do anything to help people learn about what is going on. And I thought about it. And, when first somebody says the politics in CPS, I'm a very politically active person. So I'm not only been in the streets and in the courtrooms and in the gutters fighting for parents and children. I have also been in the legislative setting. I've been to the state legislature, the federal legislature. I've tried to find that crossroads between Republicans and Democrats. And so my first thought was, well, the political aspect of the Republicans and Democrats as to CPS. But then as I gave it a little bit more thought, that word politics and CPS really has a whole different meaning. And really the important thing of especially what we're doing right now, and as this develops, is we want people to know who get involved with the system. So I sat down and I said, the politics of CPS is really the interaction of what is happening in the system while the people are experiencing it. And being the type A person that I am, I put together a PowerPoint on it also to kind of help keep me on track. And there's so many different tentacles to it. I thought it was a good way for us to do that. So am I able to share my screen? It looks like maybe I am. Let me see if I can get this up and see what happens here. So can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, let me put this little bar up here so it's out of my way. All right, so we're going to talk about the politics and the players of CPS. And Cynthia, having been a parent who's gone through this, I mean, I'm an attorney who's worked with hundreds of people, and my heart breaks for them every time I go through it. But, you know, because Cynthia has actually gone through this, I am going to ask her, you know, to really give us some input as we go forward. So the first thing, oops, let me figure out how to make my slides progress while we're screen sharing. It's a little bit different here. Hold on, it's not letting me, oh, there we go. All right, so the first thing is that it feels like a trap. There is just no other way to explain it. There's nothing that's comfortable or familiar when you're dealing with Child Protective Services. The fact that the agency has the word services in the name is very, very deceptive. You never let your guard down. Never, ever, ever let your guard down. And like in Tennessee, it's Department of Children's Services. In some states, it's Family and Children's Services. So it's, you know, putting services in there is a misnomer. It's really an investigative agency. It also feels like a deep, dark hole from the very beginning. That if you're a parent in this process, even if you're a relative who's trying to step in and actually help the process, you're going to feel lost. You're lost in the process. You're lost in the people. You don't understand the relationships between the people. And then you don't understand all of the code language that's going on between all the different players. And then at some point, you just look around the room, and it's whether you're in your first meeting, your first agency meeting, or whether you're in the courtroom, at some point, you're going to find yourself just like looking around the room and just saying to yourself, who are all of these people? You know, you're going to be dealing with people you never knew existed in roles you never knew existed. So before you ever got in a CPS case, you probably never knew that there was such a thing as a juvenile court intake officer or a juvenile court officer or court deputy or a, you know, service provider with CPS. And so you just get lost in this whole quandary of people. All, of course, I just want to add, who are being paid by the taxpayers. From an administrative level, you have agency people, and you're going to have to understand all of the roles of those people. And then you have the people in the legal system, all of the court people and their roles. And right now, I'm just going to call them court people, because when you first walk in a courtroom, you're hardly going to know the difference between the judge and the attorneys, because they all just kind of look alike. And, you know, the judge probably has a robe on and is sitting behind a bench. But as the process begins and everybody starts talking, you're not even going to understand what's happening. And then, of course, there's the service providers. And this is this whole other pool of people who are supposed to be helping you. And you also have to kind of understand their roles and how they play into this process. This kind of shows my age, but, you know, and I'm not quite as old as Abbott and Costello, but there was an old comedy routine that they did, which was called Who's on First? And Costello would say, well, who's on first? And Abbott would say, yes. And he'd say, I mean, the fellow's name. And Abbott said, who? And then Costello said, the guy on first. And Abbott saying, who? And so they're having this argument about the person who's on first base, whose name is actually who. And it's an absolute, it goes on for minutes and minutes and minutes. And then they talk about what, and it almost makes your brain crazy by the time you listen to this. About 5 minutes go on and on and on. But trust me, the first time you start dealing with this, you're going to feel exactly the same way. So your problem as you get involved is CPS is finding out who's on first in your case. There are so many questions. There's going to be yeses, nos, maybes, don't knows. Everybody's going to be bark at you saying different things. And what you really want to know is who has that decision-making power? What decisions are they allowed to make? Are different people given different authority at different times? And how can I, the parent, best affect the outcome of those decisions? That is the most important question of all. And of course, the answer is yes. There is more than one decision maker. There is more than one decision to make. There's going to be multiple people who want to put their 2 cents into the equation, and you're going to feel like the lowest man on the totem pole. And now, Cynthia, why don't you just kind of give us some input now based on your experience and talk about what I've said so far and how you felt during that time, during that initial process.
Of course. So number one, like you mentioned, going into court, I didn't realize that there were 7 contenders or attorneys. You know, the social worker has their own attorney. I had no idea what a guardian ad litem is, which is the children's attorney. And then my ex-husband's attorney. And then my mother, who was involved, who was the one who kidnapped my children, she hired her own attorney. So, and then there was the judge, and like you said, all these other players. For example, with the services, I had to go to parenting, I had to go to domestic violence, and then there's also things like drug and alcohol, maybe rehab, anger management. There are lots of things. I also had to do psych evaluations. I can definitely tell you, my therapist that they assigned me to, I thank God for him, because he actually was a huge help in my case. However, when he would send his reports to court, the social worker supervisor would call him and tell him that I was manipulating him, that I was a narcissist, and he couldn't identify that. And his response is, I've been doing this for 50 years. You have no idea what you're talking about. He luckily gets played a part in all the aspects of CPS. He was also a social worker and a supervisor and so on and so forth. But then all the way to my psych evaluation, where that therapist was hitting on me the whole time.
Oh my gosh.
And
Oh
literally making me super uncomfortable, asking me out, like during the psych eval. So
Wow.
luckily, I had my own personal psych eval as well, because that is one thing that I always advise is whatever they're asking you to do, make sure you're getting your own as well. So that way, if theirs is negative against you, you have something you can at least fight with.
Right. So if you were talking to a parent, because I'm kind of talking to them from an attorney who's worked with hundreds of cases, right? And so, of course, as an attorney, when I took on a new case, or when I talk to new people, it's so normal. I mean, it's kind of normalized. I mean, I know when I look around the room, let's just say your first experience when you walk in a courtroom, I can assess like what all the players, what all their roles are as soon as I walk in the room. But just kind of tell parents now, if they're new at this and if they're able to catch this video before they get too deeply involved, so they can start educating themselves, which is what we want. What is that feeling when you first get into that situation and you face all of these people in a courtroom or in your first agency meeting?
It literally feels like you cannot breathe. For me, it literally, and I don't want to get emotional because I remember it, it's like super triggering, even though it was 6 years ago. It literally feels like somebody sucked all the air out of me and I'm trying to catch my breath. The other thing is you want to cry. You want to literally just have a meltdown. And unfortunately, when you do that, then they throw the erratic behavior at you and for having emotions. So I would highly suggest don't do that. But it is the worst feeling, like everybody is against you.
Yeah.
And you're standing there, unfortunately, trying to defend yourself. And I I had a court appointed attorney in the beginning who did nothing for me. It felt like they were against me as well. They never brought anything up. So that was a fight in itself, trying to
Right.
call and get a hold of them and, what is going on? No response. The best thing I can also advise is hiring a private attorney,
Yeah. Well, we're
somebody
going
who
to get
has a
into that.
fight in them.
Right. So we're going to get into that. And so let's start breaking it down so people who take a look at this can really start to unravel like who the players are, what they're doing, what kind of obstacles they're going to face. So first, the agency, the state agency. Now, every state it names these agencies something different. In Tennessee, it's the Department of Children's Services, but whatever your state agency is, it's going to be some other name. I don't know why there's no uniformity in this, but every time I'm working with somebody in a different state, I have to sit down and figure out what they call that agency. So within the agency itself, you have an investigator. You have an investigative team, and I'll come back to that in a minute. You have a caseworker, a foster care worker, an education specialist, a facilitator, and supervisors. So I want to come back. And of course, the investigator is the one that you first hear the knock on the door. They're the person who opens the investigation, who does those first interview, the most intrusive and the most aggressive, usually. And it really, the thing that I see about it as an attorney and for the clients that I've worked with, that investigator who's always aggressive really kind of sets the stage for the parent, really kind of sets the stage for this whole process is going to occur as something that's going to be contentious and adversarial. The investigative team, which a lot of parents don't even understand, in Tennessee, it's called CPIT, C-P-I-T, the Child Protection Investigative Team. And the investigative team will consist of not just the CPS worker, but also law enforcement, sometimes somebody from the doctor, the hospital, which we're going to come back to in a second. And it can also include the district attorney. And parents don't even know. And I know I have challenged this at several points along the way, as far as doctors coming in and releasing HIPAA information on the children and the families. But most parents don't even know that that's going on behind the scenes. And then the caseworker, so there's some magical moment, and it's kind of hard to tell when it is, but you go from an investigator to a caseworker. And the caseworker generally, once your kids are removed, the caseworker is the one who's supposed to be ensuring the safety and the welfare of your children. They're the ones who are supposed to get the proper placement for them. The foster care worker is also the person who's responsible for the care and safety of your children. And then they throw in this education specialist who's supposed to be helping the children get their records, et cetera. I don't know. It's just more clutter in the process, it looks like to me. Every time you have a meeting, there'll be somebody called a facilitator, which I don't know what their background and training is, but sometimes they actually, are more trouble than they are helpful. And then the supervisors, there are supervisors for the investigators and supervisors for the caseworkers, supervisors for the foster care workers. So there's a whole ton of supervisors. And basically what you're going to learn that in these bureaucratic agencies, there are layers and layers and layers and layers and layers and layers in a bureaucracy. And these people who are at the bottom of the rails, and I'm going to talk about that again, but the bottom of the rails out there in the trenches working with parents really don't feel like they're very much appreciated by the top echelon anyway. So they already have this ill adjustment to their work environment. So these are, as we go into this and talk about it, we're going to talk about how do we identify these people, how important it is from the very, very beginning to have all of their names, their roles, their phone numbers, their email addresses, so that you can continue to be in contact. And then there's the court. And of course, in the court, you see this delightful little picture here of somebody being cross-examined. I feel like that's me. That's kind of how I wanted to do, is like sometimes get right up in their face. And you see a judge there who looks like he may have a smile on his face, which is not the case generally. So, you're going to have the CPS attorney, a guardian ad litem. The parents are going to have attorneys. You may have what's called a preference attorney or an attorney ad litem for the children. You have a judge, you have probation officers, you have court officers, you have clerks. And I know I have stood in the courtroom with a parent, and I've actually counted out loud all of the people in the room who are against my client parent. And I've said, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 people in this room that are on the taxpayer payrolls, and all my client has is me. So the parent stepping into this, just as you walk into it, you need to understand from the get-go that this entire system is really massive. It's a massive system. And you, just as Cynthia said, you kind of feel like you get lost and sucked into it. And you need to understand those relationships. But again, you want their names, their contact information, who they are, what their role is, and every single person should be considered an adversary to you. Hopefully not your own attorneys, but we're going to talk about that again as well. So the providers, and this is, so who are the providers? And I'm just going to pretend that somebody watching this is just getting involved with CPS. They don't even know what I'm talking about when I say the providers. It sounds like some kind of freaky, scary Netflix movie, right? The providers, right? Some kind of sci-fi Future X movie of the people who dole out your food and your sustenance, right? I can just visualize it now. But the providers are the people who are directly contracted. Do not be mistaken. They are not independent. They are directly contracted by the state agency, by taxpayer dollars, to make you this better person. They are training you in anger management and parenting and home services and budgeting. They're acting as visitation supervisors. They're the psychologist and the therapist, the forensic interviewers, the foster parents, and even the CASA court-appointed special advocates. So all of these players, even though they appear to be the helpers, right? So they're supposed to be the helpers, but they are so tied in financially with the CPS organization and with the whole entire bureaucratic system that you cannot assume that they want the best for you. And that's really, sadly, the most important part of everything we're going to talk about today is, as a parent, you are out there like the Lone Ranger at many, many points of the game. And remember that a lot of the points, a lot of the places, your attorney, even if you have the best, most aggressive attorney in the world, I mean, even as I worked with clients, your attorney cannot be the intervener in every situation. Because if you're ordered to go to an anger, well, let's take a psychologist or a therapist, just like Cynthia was talking about. Your attorney can't be sitting there beside you, monitoring and trying to help assist with the outcome in that situation. And that is why you have to be so armed with, what kind of questions do I ask? How can this be better? How can I trust them? And so, Cynthia, I want to stop right here because you've already talked about the psychologist and the therapist and how you felt like you were really just used and abused during that process. Can you explain now, is there something there that could have been better had you known what you know today?
Sure. One thing that, I mean, I guess it would fall under number 3, the psychologists and therapists. So my children were assigned to go see unfortunately, a sexual assault therapist where they had been assaulted, not in my care. And the whole time that my children were seeing them, my mom, who again was the one involved and on the side of keeping my children from me, would go in and be the one communicating with that therapist, which is not allowed. And the therapist would then go and provide that information to the courtroom. So that is one thing, I felt very nervous, like with my own therapist, of can I even trust this person? Because are they going to use anything from my past against me? That's something that does get brought up, by the way, is, back in 2005, I had to be put on anxiety medication for a situation that happened then. And that was brought up in my court case 12 years later,
Yeah.
and I hear that all the time, like, oh, back in 94, I had a ticket and now they're using it against me. And that's why they won't let me have the children or whatever
Right.
the reason is.
Right. So
Um,
let me talk a little bit about the psychologist therapist issue, because when you and when you started into this and you're ordered to go to therapy or you're ordered to do a psych eval, people kind of go into it blindly. Rarely does a court set any parameters. And this is why it's so important. If your attorney does not do this, it's so important that the parent be well advised in knowing what questions to ask. And so, for instance, here are some of the things that I tell parents. Sometimes I tell them, and we're going to come back and talk about recording, but sometimes I tell them to record the sessions. Don't even tell them, just record the sessions. Now, some therapists are wise to this now, and they will say, look, you cannot record this, you can't record it. But you know what? It's your therapy session, and there has to be some interface between you and the court. One of the other things that I do and have done is I ask the court for some parameters up front, such as, let's say in your example where a relative has the children and then the children are ordered to go to therapy, and it's that relative who is taking the children to therapy. I ask the court to outline some of the parameters of how that's going to happen. In other words, so that you ask the judge, you say, so I want to make sure that the children are going in to be talked to by the therapist by themselves, that the therapist is not to be influenced by the custodian. And and if they say, well, the custodian has to tell the therapist what's going on, that's when I say, well, that person can easily write down some notes, make some notes of some observations that have been made. Those notes, which are a hard copy, can be put in the therapist records, and then the therapist, if they feel that they have to, they can then ask questions about that. But the parent, or their attorney, should be able to get a copy of all the notes, all the additions, all the information they received, all the email communication they've had with any third party, and you have to push for that. So this is my, word to people right now, because the Cynthia's, I understand, I've had similar things happen with parents where, this wrangling goes on. And, if you do hire a private attorney, which, can be extremely expensive, you can't really call your attorney every time you have a suspicion that you think somehow something's gotten out of whack, right? Because attorneys bill for their time, and you end up spending thousands and thousands of dollars just trying to undo some of the chaos that was created by not having a good format and a good floor plan for what needs to happen in the first place. So, there are things you want to lay the foundation. You want to ask the questions. You want the court to put it, you want it solidified or memorialized in some type of writing or court order. If we're going to have a therapist intervene, we want to make sure, if it's a therapist for the children, that the therapist is not being influenced by other people, and that the parents get all the notes and all the records. So, and then with the psychologist and the evaluation, what I did my master's in psychology before I went into law. And so I know about psychological testing. I know about the different kinds of testing, the different types of testing they can do. And I know the difference between the MMPI and the parental assessment, the PAS, I think it's called. And then the Rorschach, right? Sometimes they even give Rorschach tests. I know the difference in those. And so you really want to find out in advance what kind of testing is going to occur, because some people can do testing and some people can't. And if the judge actually sends you to a psychiatrist, which we have a psychiatrist in Nashville that they love to use, psychiatrists are not qualified to do psychological testing. That has to go through somebody who has that type of education and license. So you can't just blanket sign off on having, and this is actually probably a whole different training thing to talk about perm plans and how to have those discussions. But you, in dealing with these providers as a parent, you have a right to finding out what's going on behind the scenes. Same thing with forensic interviews. Sometimes those are put under seal, but you have a right to see those. The notes, especially foster parents, and notes that are made about the foster parents, and then the CASA. And I'm going to come back and talk about more about CASA in a minute. So how do these players fit together? And if you just think about this for a minute, Cynthia, because after I talk about this, I want you to give the parents a little input on this as well. So the most important thing to know is that the relationship between the judges and the other court players. The judges appoint parent attorneys and the guardian ad litems, and the judges hires the magistrates, the court officers, the clerks, anyone else working in the courtroom setting. The tough decisions that have to be made about you and your children may be influenced by relationships that go beyond your case. So important. And I'm going to give you a short example, and then I want Cynthia to give us some input on this as well. And that is, parents have come to me and they have said this almost verbatim. My attorney won't fight for me because they say after my case is over, they have to continue to work with these people. And that means that their attorney's relationship with the judge, or relationship with the CPS attorneys, or relationship with the CPS investigators is more important than drilling down and fighting for you in your case. Now, Cynthia, early on, you made a comment about you did have a court-appointed attorney before you hired a private attorney. So now that I've brought this up and started telling people they need to try to tie this together, can you kind of explain what you felt about your court-appointed attorney and what drove you to find a different counsel?
Absolutely. Number one, the difficulty of getting a hold of them, which I hear all the time. Number two, the fact that I would bring evidence in against the other side and against what they were saying. For example, I was accused of being a drug addict, and by my mother, and I had proof of years of random drug testing because of my health issues. So I have doctors that will test me to make sure my medication levels are on point, but they test for everything. And I had years and plus their notes saying, I've never been on drugs, and I don't have any. Currently, I'm not on any, but the court-appointed attorney refused to bring any of that information up. They also refused to take it to trial. They also refused to inform me of anything. They don't communicate with you, so you don't know what to expect, what you're walking into. Nothing.
Mm.
So
And did you
no
feel at some
response.
point it was because he thought other people in this whole process were more important than you were?
Yes, I felt like my court appointed attorney was working for the other side, where they
Mm.
trusted the social workers and were just whatever they said goes.
Yeah,
And that's what my attorney followed in suit with. Literally, it was just another person against me.
right. So as a parent, while you go through this, and again, attorneys know some of these things. Some attorneys like me get down into the nitty gritty more as far as the finances, but you have to ask yourself this question: are there competing interests in the outcome? So it's a horrible question. It's a horrid question to have to consider, but you must, because yes, there are definitely competing interest in what is happening all around you. So during the whole process, once you start to see what's going on, and once you start to figure out that how everything is intertwined and how everything's like a big web of deceit, you really will feel like it's family justice and restoration versus better statistics for the agency and the court. They just want better stats. They want more adjudications. They want more removals. They want more findings against parents. They want more months of separation because they get more money for that period of separation. Now, the attorneys, as I was putting together my presentation, I found this picture, which I thought was just so fitting. And especially, I have a client right now who's working on a new case, and I'm not able to take the new case because they've continued to haunt him, but he's had to hire somebody else. And he shared with me some things that have happened. And I don't even know this guy. And I visualize him looking just like this because he wants to make all of the decisions. He has even told the client he is making the legal decisions for the case and not his client. And so we have court-appointed attorneys versus retained attorneys. And again, if you're new, a court-appointed attorney is when you get hit with one of these cases and you feel like you cannot afford an attorney because it is very expensive. You go to court, you fill out an affidavit of indigency, and you ask for a court-appointed attorney. From the very beginning, you've got to remember the name says it all. The court-appointed means judge appointed. He is appointed by the judge. This is often their sole source of income is judicial appointments, and they have limited billing that they can put on the case. So most of these attorneys, their billing is capped. The states differ from state to state, but it's never as much as it really needs to be. And, the state agency attorneys can basically wear out the time and wear out the case. So the attorneys can't even bill anymore. So since they're making a lower hourly rate than retained attorneys, sometimes they just back off and go in the corner and devise their own schemes, right? So, and then you have retained attorneys, and retained attorneys are the attorneys that you hire to represent you. Now, sometimes the problem is with retained attorneys, and this has changed a little bit over the years, but often it's hard to find a retained attorney with that specialty training and knowledge in juvenile law and dependency and neglect. There are so many little nuances to it that somebody who's practicing personal injury or bankruptcy or contract law really cannot walk into this setting without getting just blindsided about the twists and the turns and the meetings and the agendas and the lack of discovery and the protective orders and the providers. That's something they never have to deal with. How to deal with experts, because that's all nuanced in the juvenile court system. So sometimes with retained attorney, your problem becomes whether or not they have sufficient training. The other thing is just honestly, some attorneys that come into this who do not have a background, they really feel helpless against CPS machine, especially when they walk into the courtroom on a removal hearing and they find out that the judge has done an ex parte order on hearsay allegations that have never been investigated. And all they have to have is probable cause, and they can do it on hearsay. And it doesn't matter what you say, they're going to keep your kids in foster care. So sometimes attorneys just feel helpless. They don't even know, well, there's a whole nother avenue that we can take. I can start asking for least restrictive means hearing, et cetera. And then the other thing is the delay that is caused by the state agency ends up costing the parents thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. I mean, it got to the place where when a parent came to me and their children had already been removed, I said, it's a $50,000 fight. It's endless. They're going to wear us out. They're going to draw it out. They're going to make us come to court for nothing. And they can do that. And that's part of their strategy, is to wear out the private attorneys so they can no longer continue in the case. And then there's the CP. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I add something? People think that they can hire a family law attorney to, like you were mentioning, and not the training. People need to realize that you need a juvenile dependency attorney, not a family law attorney, somebody who
Right.
does specialize in CPS and has done it before.
Yeah, and it differs state to state. So even when people have contacted me from other states and really want me to represent them, I really have to say there's so many changes. It can be the standard of proof. It can be how they do the hearings. So, I mean, it's not just court specialized, but it's also state. All right, so let's talk about CPS workers. And, I'm talking about both the investigators and the caseworkers. And I put here with an agenda. I just don't even know how else to explain it. But everything that can be wrong about a job exists for CPS and DCS workers. I mean, the low-level workers, again, you have layers and layers and layers of bureaucracy. They're overworked. They're pushed by their supervisors. The quote unquote social work that they went to college for is not social work at all. They have quotas, they have placements, they have adoptions, and they see the parent as the enemy to getting their job done. Now, I'm saying this not just because I've personally interviewed, talked to, watched these like a hawk, these CPS workers. In Tennessee, there was what was called a culture survey done in the spring of 21 or 22. And I downloaded that entire culture survey, which was a survey of all the CPS workers on everything they felt about their job. And, again, it's a whole separate video for me to pull those clips out. And I think it's one of my videos up on YouTube. But the things that they said, which basically said they don't care about us, they overwork us, they put us in dangerous situations, they really want to be out of that job and into a different job. But when you look at some of these rural communities and, out in the counties where they don't have a lot of job opportunities, they often feel that working for the CPS organization is a quote unquote stable job. Because first of all, nobody else wants it. It's a state job, you have insurance, et cetera. In some of the places like California, they are county jobs, but they like that stability of a government job. And so they grind through it. They really are not social workers. And the few that did go to work to learn social work find out pretty quickly that's not what they're doing at all. And then there's the judges. And, I tuned in to part of the last presentation where Art, I don't know Art, but it sounds like I probably need to know Art, because some of the things he said are things that I've dealt with as well. When the judges put the attorneys, even not just the parents, and this is something parents, I mean, they do need to understand this, because parents sometimes feel like their attorneys aren't doing anything for them. But honestly, attorneys, and if you listen to Art, you can understand that attorneys have a certain fearfulness of dealing with judges who have hostile attitudes. And of course, I have a whole story on how far it went, where they made me a criminal, and now it's falling apart, but how much it's interrupted my ability to help families. But sometimes judges have attitudes. And, and I've talked about judicial accountability for well over 14 years. There's really no true oversight with the Judicial Ethics Board. They have immunity from lawsuits. You can't sue them. Parents are silenced both in and out of the courtroom. The review process and the appeal process is absolutely torturous. And if you heard Art speak, or you go back and listen to that, you can hear him say, as a very aggressive attorney, that he even spent a weekend preparing an emergency writ to be heard by the court. Because of the things that the position that the judge was putting him in. The control, the judge has control over the courtroom and the players. The judge can order you to stand up and sit down. The judge can order you to leave the courtroom, to shut your mouth, to answer the question. I mean, again, as an attorney, and I walked in and out of these courtrooms over and over and over again. And I had dozens of judges that I appeared in front of, because I went all over the state of Tennessee on purpose, because I wanted to be known across the state, and I wanted to know what the courtrooms were like across the states. But, I don't want to say jaded to it, because you're always surprised and shocked, but I've seen tricks that they've pulled, leaving your case to the end of the docket when everybody else has left the courtroom, so that they can scold you or scold your client or call you out, or try to compel something that they know is probably not correct. So the judges, and this is so sad, and it's so frightening, because this one person has the ultimate decision as to whether or not your child has a parent. And, again, it's frightening, it's terrible, it's scary, and it's a part of the process you have to deal with. And Cynthia, can you share some of your insight or your experience with that?
Yes. The parents silenced. Number one, like I was mentioning earlier, how I never had a voice in the courtroom until I did hire a private attorney. I was never asked any questions. I was never allowed to speak. The other thing that you had brought up in a previous slide was the CPS with an agenda. That is exactly what it is. If there's a foster parent that can't have a child, for example, or is looking for a child of your sorts, of the children you have, now you have that person fighting against you too. And then they're able to show, oh, well, I'm a better parent because I'm a foster parent and I've gone through this training, and blah, 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 blah. And again, everybody has a voice except for you in the courtroom.
Right, exactly. All right. So in addition, and we may not be able to cover everything. I don't know if Vince will cut us off or not, or give us a few extra minutes. But the other thing is the children's hospitals and the CAPs. And the CAPs are the child abuse pediatricians. The children's hospitals, and there's one in every major town, they have financial conflicts of interest. They become involved. They diagnose child abuse. They come to court and testify. But they receive money directly from the state agencies, and then they receive money for care of children in foster care. These CAPs, the child abuse pediatricians, is a certification that was developed in 2009 by the American Academy of Pediatricians. They are employed, and some of them, not always, but I know in Tennessee now we have an employee of a state agency who is a doctor with an AAP certification, and they're also often contracted to do death reviews. All right, so let's talk a minute about the money trail. Now, the players, of course, always, I'm sure anybody who's ever been concerned with political influence has heard the term follow the money. So the Title IV-E money for children in foster care is what drives the ship. This is the federal money that flows to the state budgets, and it's a per head, per day, per diem for children. The massive state administrative budgets depend on Title IV-E funds. And the funding is really kind of the behind the curtain that parents don't know. And I really sometimes I think about the imagery from The Wizard of Oz when they pull back the curtain and they see the little man with the levers who is really controlling the big Oz and the Oz speaking. But the funding is really where the levers are being pulled. And here's an example of Tennessee DCS. And I know it's really tiny. You may not be able to read it, but this is the 2022-23 budget. And you can see here that their total budget has now burgeoned, and it is, and actually, I don't have that number correct. It looks like $1 million there. And if you look down here in the corner, it's actually $1,119,500,000. And then the amount of money from the state tax money, again, I've left some zeros off of there. You can see it down here in the corner, is $463 million. And the federal tax money is $192 million. And the other, which is undefined, is $463 million. And I will tell you, I have contacted the State Department of Treasury and tried to figure out what other is, and nobody can seem to tell me. Now, the children's hospital.
Sorry,
Yeah, go ahead.
somebody mentioned or asked, how can you find like how much it is per kid per day in your particular state?
Okay, so there's a couple different ways to do that. That's a good question. One way is to ask for, you can do an open records request for a contract. So if you know one of the providers that's doing foster care, you can ask for a provider contract at listing the schedule of payments. And in every state, they have different levels of children. They classify your child as soon as they come into foster care. They can be a level 1, a level 2, a level 3, a level 4. It goes all the way up to about level 9. And as your child increases in needs or levels, the payments go up. So for instance, in Tennessee, I think a level 1 child is only about $900 a month as far as what the foster care parent is paid. But now remember, they're getting about twice that amount from the Title IV-E funds. But in Tennessee, they always are trying to up the children to a level 2, which doubles that money. And it doesn't take much to up them to a level 2. You know, it can be a child who has ADHD or, who has anxiety, and they can up them to level 2. So we talked about the
medically fragile child.
Right. We talked about the children's hospitals. Here's, again, just an example in Tennessee. Vanderbilt Hospital, Vanderbilt Medical Group is paid directly from the Department of Children's Services. And over a 5-year period, I've got an increase of $1 million, but it's really about 600,000, where in 2010, it went from 2.7 million all the way up to 3.2 million. So definitely the Children's Hospital have a financial conflict of interest. So what do you do? Okay, so we're at the end of our time. And I guess if Vince jumps in here and cuts us off, we'll have to wrap it up and do something else. But if he doesn't, then, oops, hang on here.
Go ahead and keep going. I'm very interested in this.
Okay, good. Well, I was trying to time myself, but I wanted to make sure Cynthia had input. So, all right. So now we're going into the section of what do you do? So again, if you're a new parent that's never been through this, I'm sure by now you're sort of shaking at your knees, or if you are a parent that's been through it, or you're still in the middle of it, you're kind of nodding your head. Yes, I've witnessed all those things. I've experienced all those things. What do? I feel like I'm in that dark, deep hole. So it really gets down to this diligence. And the diligence is in what you as a parent start to take on. And you really have to do it from day one. But if you're already in the middle of it and you did not start it on day one, then go ahead and just grab onto it now and start doing it. So you have to make notes on everything. And my image here is of a notebook with a piece of paper. Some people, it's better, it's easier for them with a piece of paper. Other people do it in their phone. These days with voice to text, you can, if you have an iPhone, you can do it in your notes. If you have an Android, they have this kind of notes function. You can download Google Docs and then you can access it from any computer, and you can actually voice text it, or you can start to type it in and do like a running diary. Some people like a little notebook that they just keep with them all the time in this. And actually, I think that paper is, kind of a therapeutic good thing to have, that tangible thing where you have that little notebook with you to make a note every time something happens. You must get everyone's name, their first and their last name. You need to know who they work for, who they report to, how they're paid, and what their role is. And my word to parents is don't be afraid to ask. So as you have heard us talk about, when you step into this, when you have that first meeting or that first court appearance and you see this massive amount of people, don't be afraid to ask who is who. And you can do it by, if you're in a courtroom, ask your attorney to identify the people for you. If you're trying to represent yourself or you don't have an attorney yet, or even if it's the day you're there getting a court appointed attorney, just be respectful to the judge and just say, Judge, could everybody introduce themselves? Could I know who the people are? Or if you don't do it right there in the courtroom, walk up to them in the hallway and ask them, just say, I saw you in the courtroom. I don't have your name and contact information. I need to get that right now. And every agency meeting, every court appearance, keep your eyes open 100% and watch. And always ask for the best means to communicate, to complain, to report whenever you feel like there's been a conflict, unresponsiveness, or disrespect. And so, Cynthia, can you give us some input here? Did you at some point, I know you came in, you got a court-appointed attorney, you're being just sort of hit with everything that's going on from all sides. I mean, were you able to finally grab onto your case and start documenting what was happening?
Number one, with the comments that I'm reading, I did have a planner as well. And every day that something happened, I wrote in that planner exactly what happened. I wish I knew that I could have recorded back then, whether it was video and audio or just video. Honestly, I had no idea what my rights were from day one up until I had met Mr. Davis, and he told me, what my rights were, what I should have done, could have done, but now we're already here. So we got to focus on here forward, cannot look back. I know they mentioned it earlier. Don't worry about being right, worry about, fighting for your kids. If you want to be right later, then you can worry about suing them later. A couple things that I learned I could have done again from Mr. Davis was making a list of, 25 people that could have taken my kids, not necessarily would take them, but could have taken them, giving opportunity, to get them out of foster care if possible. Unfortunately, in my situation, they were stuck with my mother, who is their grandmother, who, had rights, I guess, to take my kids, and be the logical choice, since they were with family. Another thing is making binders of everything that has happened, and also making sure you're making enough copies for everybody in the courtroom. The other person that we didn't mention, that I was thinking about as far as the players, is the people that watch your visitation, the monitors. That's a huge one too. There was so much that happened in my visitations that were also supposedly recorded and were supposed to be brought forth in court that never were. But luckily I had written them down, and that also can be used to then bring up that